Boomers are the most selfish generation in American history by far.
Why? Because they don't want to give up their houses?
The size of an average American house is basically double what it was 100 years ago. Why? That's a good question, right? The older generation used to be pretty much the standard. If it was a single person, like the other parent was dead, they would sell their home and move back in with the kids. If it was a couple, they would sell their home, downsize to a smaller one, and give that money in a trust to the kids. Gen X is the first generation in all of American history, including the Depression generation, that's doing worse financially than their parents did. The first one. Why is that? It's not because they didn't work hard. They worked really hard.
What's the expectation that you worked your ass off your entire life, you bought your house,
the expectation
and now people want you to sell it?
Yeah, the expectation is you put more into your kids than you do into the twilight years of your own life, which is the expectation for a good human being, actually.
Yeah, I'm 100% with Dan on this one. From what I know, the boomers are the only generation who has left the succeeding generation worse off than they were.
If you're 80 years old, you personally, and your kids are struggling financially and you're living in a big house doing well, that's fucked. I mean, that's insane. The whole point of being a parent is to give a better life to your children than you had.
What's good? What's good? This is about nobody wants to be the silent generation. That's the generation before the baby boomers. You know, the silent generation, the one before that was like the greatest generation. But I'm talking about the silent generation. Nobody wants to be them. Part of the whole issue with to people talking about baby boomers and being selfish and the economy, that's a different part. I'll touch that in a minute. But nobody wants to be the silent generation because that's the generation where that's the generation of the grandparents, you know, basically raising the kids. You get what I'm saying? Like my grandparents were silent generation. My parents' boomers or whatever. So I remember me being Gen X. A lot of us Gen Xers were raised by grandparents. A lot of us. A lot of Gen Xers were the quote unquote latchkey kids. And what I see and what my grandparents told me when they were alive, like they wanted us to not do what they went through. And what I mean by that is the silent generation is the generation that probably that worked from childhood to elderly and died. And some of them, you know, that's the generation of people who might have died at 52. You get what I'm saying? A lot of y'all don't realize like people lived long, but in a general sense, especially the men, wasn't living that long. Those are the men y'all talk about who you know, they were working on cars and cutting grass and fixing houses and basically working themselves to death and living bummy and leaving the house to, you know, which would be my grandparents, and y'all was raised in we came up in big mama house or grandma house, because granddad worked himself to death. That's what happened, and their kids, you know, and I say they're kids because people were having kids at earlier ages back then. So their kids, the boomers could be silent generation kids, and they could be greatest generations kids. They could be either one. So that was a thing. And I get into that part because the kids didn't want to be a 50-year-old grandparent taking care of 3, 4, 5-year-olds. You get what I'm saying? They didn't want to do that. Their parents did that. And some of those people, their parents took care of their kids. And then you go, man, these grandparents ain't taking care of their grandkids. Like when I grew up, they never intended to be their parents. And some of y'all are looking for that, and y'all don't realize wrong generation. Like us Gen Xers, we might wind up doing that. You know what I mean? That might be thing. I'm not gonna say we might be the people doing that. Some of us will, some of us won't. Because I remember my grandparents like, listen, Help people who help themselves. Don't, don't be out here helping people who are not helping themselves. That was a thing. So when it comes to the hard work, you don't see it as much anymore because, nobody wants to get their hands dirty like that. Nobody wants to work themselves to death and then pass on property and people piss on it when these people are dead. That's a normal thing. That's not just a black thing. That's actually a thing that's been done for years and years and years. Now, the economic part of it. Um, Here's what people don't talk about with baby boomers. Baby boomers basically are the last group born in Jim Crow. So they were raised in selfishness. You get what I'm saying? Silent generation. It still had the World War, one, World War II, silent generation, greatest generation. It was still Jim Crow that whole time, but Jim Crow ending is on the back end of baby boomers years. So people were out for self. You got to remember, baby boomers are considered the people that they went through the civil rights movement, they went to Woodstock, and then they did a complete 180. No, they were raised in Jim Crow. They just reverted back to who they were. And I'm not just talking about the racial aspect. I'm talking about the selfish aspect of, you know, I'm gonna get mine, irregardless of who it destroys, right or wrong. That was a thing. That was a thing. So as the years went on from the 60s to now, people forget for some odd reason, um, the boom of technology is what made people rich. People were invested in IBM and Apple in the beginning. So, you know, Amco, Chevron, Texaco, before, the things were booming and booming and booming. Johnson and Johnson, that's part of their wealth. They were early investors as far as even, job 401k type stuff. They were early investors in that. And I remember this because when my grandmother retired from Southwestern Bell, AT&T, you know, and she was like, I'm rich, And at my job, I remember one of my first encounters with a guy that I didn't know, old black man, white beard. He was like, "Hey, do what I do. I'm telling this now, youngster, do what I did, and you're gonna be a millionaire like me." And I was like, "Oh, millionaire?" He said, "Yeah." So I did what he did. You get what I'm saying? The only difference is he probably got more. I'm not done yet, but he probably got more out of it in a general sense than I did because he was on the early end of the investment portfolio. Because he talked to me in the early 2000s, so that means he was doing that from the 80s. My grandmother was the same. So, and when they talk about the house size and everything got bigger and people don't downsize, yeah, y'all forget about something. Now, I hate to say this. A lot of people are right. Boomers' parents, somebody died, they downsized their life. The family, quote unquote, took care of them, which was true, very true. And then when that particular person died, nobody else wanted to do that. And I say that because people weren't invested in family, like people aren't invested in family as they were back then. I love my grandparents. They're dead, all of them. I love them. Great grandparents, love them. Aunts and uncles, depending on which ones. Well, I ain't gonna front. Most of my aunts and uncles are really dope. I can't say that. Some of the other different further down parts of the family. Why I oughta, but that whole family dynamic completely changed. Plus, you had people moving. Family used to be, we all in the same city or not too far from the city that our family's from. But now you got people, you know, like I got family, shit, L.A., Arizona, of course Chicago, but everybody's from New Orleans, like Georgia, Philadelphia. Shit, I'm missing places because it's all in Texas. Yes, I don't know if the Florida people still there. I ain't too sure about that one, but it's like 3 other places. Colorado is. I'm missing the other 2. Shit, but all of that moving changed the dynamic of the closeness because now you had a family of, let's just say, good 20 people that's all close knit. Now those 20 people live in 10 different places. So ain't no way in hell you gonna get somebody to downsize and come. That's not gonna happen. Not gonna happen. And I say that because Gen X is probably gonna be that because I would say it's predominantly Gen X that has the kids living with them at that are in their 20s. Kids went to college, but they staying at home. I think it's a lot of Gen Xers who have that situation where the kids can't necessarily get on their feet because of America's economy, and sometimes because of people's work ethic. Don't get it twisted, because even with millennials, I'm on a tail end of Gen X. Like I was at the end of '79. I don't know why they changed it because '79 was the cutoff for Gen X, and now it's 80, and then I saw one was 84. But I get into that for this particular reason. People around my age group, from 46, to maybe about 41, y'all or 40, y'all don't act like y'all didn't have a shot to buy a house and real estate at a good price. You're lying. From down, I'll just say from 39 under, definitely understand. So don't get it twisted, man. Like, people are blaming boomers, and I understand it, but behind that, nobody wants to be the silent generation because they don't want to make all of those sacrifices. That's the crux of the issue. Nobody really are willing to make those sacrifices for the greater good of family. But that's just my point of view. Tell me what you think. Catch you on the next one. Peace.